Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 32 of All About Nothing. I'm going to talk to you today about one of my favorite subjects. And they say people become sex therapists because they think about sex 24 hours a day. And I don't think about it 24 hours a day, a day anymore, but there were times in my life that I did. So, what I want to talk about today is when there seems like a flatness sexually in the relationship. And people have all kinds of explanations for this. It may have been there all along. It may be something one notices in oneself or one's partner and immediately start wondering, what is wrong with me? So I want to talk about that because there are lots of different theories about what that means. And I want to tell you some of the ways that I think about it from a neglect-informed perspective. And once again, it is more relevant to people with neglect histories. So I don't want to generalize across the board about this, but I want to invite you to consider some of these explanations for this low level of sexual energy. And first of all, the child of neglect, because the survivor of neglect, their default injury is loss and rejection. That is our default way of interpreting events. So if there's a low level of desire in the relationship coming from my partner, I will assume or I will interpret that to mean they don't want me. They are rejecting me. Sidebar, as the attachment theory people tell us, and I find this heartbreaking, that the attachment style that correlates to neglect, which is the avoidant, I hate that name because it sounds intentional and it's not, but the avoidant attachment style, sometimes the primary other is repelled by the infant's body. So the mother or the caregiver doesn't want to touch their child. And so that child will grow up feeling repellent, repulsive, untouchable, which is a devastating experience, but it's lodged in the nervous system so early, and it's lodged in an unremembered way, but more in a emotional, somatic, sensory way that it's not even recognizable as a memory, but it lives in the body as a belief system like, oh, I'm untouchable, I'm repulsive, I'm revolting, I'm disgusting, whatever the word might be. And that goes back to early experience that we don't remember, that I only know about because I learned about it in the attachment theory, in the attachment literature long ago, but I've certainly seen it with clients where they have this very repugnant self-image of themselves bodily and sexually. So that being said, I wanted to give a little bit of information that might give context for a low level of energy around sexuality in the relationship. So it may or may not relate or um, explain what your client is suffering from, but it's still interesting and worth knowing for the future. And who knows, it may actually be of use. So the first thing I want to identify is what I refer to, and I learned about this from Pat Love, who was an imago therapist. I don't I believe she's retired by now, but she was one of the first imago relationship therapists to start talking about sex. In fact, she wrote a book way back in the early 80s called Hot Monogamy that was one of the first books about sex that ever kind of presented in the imago relationship world. I always loved Pat, and she explained this to me, and it's something that I don't know why nobody tells us these things, but nobody told me, and so many people are relieved to learn about this. And that is that nature designs us to be turned on to the same person long enough to procreate, because it's nature's design to preserve the species. So, when we first meet somebody new and we get really excited about that person, our whole system is spiked with peptides, with neurotransmitters, with hormones that basically amp up our sexual experience, and it's like being on drugs. It's a powerful aphrodisiac cocktail that's a natural aphrodisiac because nature's design is to be turned on to this person long enough to procreate, which is about 3 to 18 months. So when we first meet somebody new, we're likely to be really hot, to be in bed all the time. I know when I first met my husband, we never quite got out the door to go out to dinner for about 2 months because we were busy. And a lot of people, that's true. And so you're really hot and sex is easy and it's fun. And even for people who have trauma histories around sex, somehow the phenylethylamine, the PEA cocktail, kind of overrides the trauma response. And sex is easy, fun, abundant, desirous. It's really hot for a while. And then after the requisite 3 to 18 months passes, well, we go back down to our baseline. And then people don't feel so hot anymore. And they might wonder, well, where did it go? And there's a flatness, and maybe there's conflict, or maybe there's arguing about who wants what and what people like and when and and if, and all these questions about it, and it starts to diminish and even maybe die away. And the couple will look at each other and go, what happened to us? Where did it go? And then they start noticing their trauma symptoms and all their quirks that didn't show up before because they were on drugs, so to speak. The drugs wear off and all these other untoward feelings start to show through. So libido, desire, energy, heat are less, and people wonder, well, do I love you, but I'm not in love with you anymore? Or is it gone? The thrill is gone? And it is nature's design. And at that point, very often, if a couple isn't going to make it, they might need to get some help together as a couple, or even as individuals, or to learn something about sexuality and what is natural at this early stage of relationship. Some people work it out by leaving and continuing to start all over again so they can get that spark back by, starting a new relationship or starting an extramarital relationship or something new and novel that will get the drugs flowing again. And some of us choose to get help so that we can begin to unwind. What is this lower desire all about? Is it a lower libido level in general, which is natural. Some people have a higher libido than others, and it's actually rare that partners are equally matched, even though in the movies it seems so easy that people are perfectly matched. They're always hot, they're always wet, they're always good to go. Life is rarely like that. And when people have responsibilities or kids or everyday life intrudes, there isn't time to just throw your partner over the kitchen table and have a quickie. There isn't always the opportunity for that, even if the energy was there. So things change when we get into an ongoing relationship. And some of it simply has to do with the natural receding of the chemistry of procreation, preserving the species. It's important to know this so that you know if you start a new relationship and it's really hot at the beginning and then it ceases to be, that there's a good explanation for that. So that's one understanding of lower level of intensity, energy, desire, excitement, libido, all of that stuff. Another thing that's useful to know, and this many of us who are therapists learned in psychology school, if we had the good fortune to have any sexuality training in psychology school, which I'm very distressed to say that most, certainly master's programs in the US, have a very minimal, if any, requirement for human sexuality education for licensing at master's level. I don't know about your country. I know that it varies by states here. When I was in graduate school way back in the Stone Age, the requirement for human sexuality in California, where I live, was 4 hours. 4 hours of education on human sexuality to get a psychology license in California. That was many years ago. I'm not sure what it is now, but I know that there's a variety of requirements and some have none in this country. So many of us know very little, if anything, about sexuality. Those of us who did have any kind of sexuality training learned the sexual response cycle begins with desire. The sexual response cycle, as I learned it, is a curve that goes like this. It starts with desire, then we get arousal, then we get orgasm, and then we get resolution. And that is the normal sexual arousal curve. Well, in 2001, a sexual researcher named Rosemary Basson, I believe she was in France or Belgium, I can't remember, but she made a really interesting and important discovery that is very normalizing for many people, which is not everybody walks around desirous. Not everyone walks around with, hot desire for sexuality rumbling in their bodies. Many do. And if you do have a high libido, it can be very uncomfortable to not get your sexual needs met, whether it be through masturbation or sexual activity, because it builds up in the nervous system and in the body, and it can feel like irritability, anger, and kind of pent up energy that needs to come out. So that is true of higher libido people. What Rosemary Basson discovered in 2001 or 2002 was that not everyone begins from desire. Some people need stimulation to get to the point of desire. They can get there, but they might need a little help to get there, whether it be visual through having a partner who has erotic clothing or lack of clothing, or some kind of visual like video material or erotica in poetry that they read out loud, or fantasizing or self-stimulation or stimulation by the other physically before starting the sexual interaction. But there's nothing pathological about this. There's nothing pathological about having a lower level of desire, about having a lower level of desire than your partner. Most couples, and certainly many couples, are not equally matched. One partner may have a much higher libido than the other. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with either one. It's just different. It is like appetites, it's like tastes, it's like needs. And so, what we need to do is learn about our partner and learn what we need to do to meet our partners halfway. And if there's a need for some kind of additional stimulation, like watching a video, there's no shame in that, or reading erotica aloud or alone, or fantasizing privately or out loud, or having the partner wear more revealing clothing or less clothing or nothing, or more digital stimulation or some kind of stimulation before starting the actual interaction, whether it be on oneself or with the partner. You make the accommodations so that you can meet at the same level and have a good time. And that is normal. Another explanation for a flatness or a low level starting place is a little bit more complex, and it will take a little bit more time for me to unwind it and describe it to you. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before, and that goes back to the inescapable shock situation. The inescapable shock situation is a trauma situation, and the example of a prey animal cornered by a predator is a good visual description, and a very timely and perfect, not even metaphor, it's just an example of the same thing. And basically, when a prey animal is cornered by a larger, faster, more ferocious predator, and they can't get away because they're too small, or they're trapped, or they can't fight because they're too small and they don't have a chance against this larger animal, what do? Well, they're in what's known as an inescapable shock situation. There are two options here. One of them is they ratchet down all their bodily functions so low that the predator will think that they're dead. And most predators are not interested in dead prey, so they lose interest, they wander off, they look for something more appetizing to eat, and the prey animal waits, and when the coast is clear, they make for a safe place, they recover from this, and they disappear off and go about the rest of their day. And that is one response to the inescapable shock situation. Basically, it's called death feigning or playing possum. And it's a freeze response. And I'll put up on the notes for this video a beautiful brain scan that Ruth Lanius did way back in 2002 that really helps me to get a visual of what this looks like. Because a person's brain who is in this state, it's almost not firing at all. It does very much look like the brain of a dead person. The other option for that cornered prey animal is the freeze response, which is the variation where they ratchet down all their bodily functions so low that in effect they don't feel the pain of being eaten. So they're numb. They don't feel anything emotionally, physically. They're pretty much gone. And the brain scan, the same brain scan, correlates to this, where it looks like the person is almost dead and they're preparing, they're numbing out, they're dissociating to the point where they do appear and experience themselves as very death like or deadened, feeling nothing. So, those are two responses to the inescapable shock situation. And the infant, the neglected infant, is in such a place. They can't fight, they can't flee. The experience of neglect feels life threatening, and so, in effect, neglect is an inescapable shock situation. So very often we find a very low firing brain, which is where we get a lot of diagnoses of attention problems, ADD, ADHD, which I always thought was a problem of hyper-arousal, meaning the brain is firing high, because the idea of ADHD, hyperactive, made me think you had a fast-firing brain. But actually, the opposite is true. The brain is firing very low. And that's why ADD and ADHD are treated with things like Adderall or Ritalin, which are amphetamine drugs that speed up the brain, because the experience is flat, low, deadly. And very often, the person with this underfiring brain, which is many neglect survivors, are dissociative. They kind of function maybe slowly, or they get bored, or cannot bear waiting, cannot bear empty time, because it activates the memory of that emptiness, that numbness, that dissociativeness. So hold that thought about the deadness, the flatness, the under-firing brain. And let's shift gears again and talk about sexual desire. Well, very often the explanation for low desire might be low arousal across the board in the nervous system. So, what does this person need to wake up? Well, very often, in general, a person with an under-firing brain will need extreme stimulation to feel alive, to wake up. So very often, a person with an under-firing brain, a inescapable shock situation, neglect brain, will be thrill-seeking, will be sensation-seeking, will be risk-taking, will seek out extremes of experience, including sexually. So sometimes they might have a taste for extreme sexual experiences, including extreme pain, extreme humiliation, extreme numbers of sexual activities in one in one swoop, in one event, where there's a whole lot of excitement and arousal and ejaculation and relief, and then more and more and more. It's a way to feel alive. And very often, a partner will wonder, what's wrong with my partner? Why do they pursue such extremes? Or why don't they want me? Why am I not enough? And if you look at the underfiring or the dissociative or the deadened brain, that might explain it. So I tell you all these things rather to normalize the fact that there is a range of libidos, there is a range of explanations why there may be a low spark, a low level of desire, a desire discrepancy. And in the US, there is this burgeoning market that pathologizes, particularly women, for having some kind of desire disorder because they're not as desirous as their partner. And so there's a whole world of products for these these sorry women usually that might take to bump up their desire to please a partner who wants more sex than they do, when there may be many explanations why that person doesn't want as much sex as their partner does. So I invite you to widen your lens on low desire, because there are many possibilities to explain this. And your relationship may reflect one of them, and there may be many, many others. I think it's a worthy conversation, and certainly in with respect to being neglect informed, I'd like you to experiment with thinking about these other options, these other explanations for this flatness of desire that may make you think like there's something wrong with me, or there's something wrong with my partner, or which may make for dishonesty, or some kind of need to do something more to spice up the relationship, which may in fact be true, but it may in fact be explained in other ways. And healing from neglect, with whatever means we might use, may help with these various difficulties, both for the individual and for the couple. So that was a lot to digest today, and I leave you with all this. And there's much more to be learned about this. I don't begin to pretend that this is a comprehensive explanation, but it's a beginning of some things to think about. So I invite you to think about them, at least somewhat for now. Feel free to look at the website for other resources, other information, and thanks for watching. I will see you next time. Happy holidays, and yeah, that's it for now. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.